Well, welcome to the closing panel for the Australia-China Joint Workshop on Biodiversity Law and Governance. The title of this panel is The Past, Present and Future of Australia-China Environmental Cooperation. So this two-day workshop has explored biodiversity law and governance in Australia and China. Australia and China are two of the world's 17 megadiverse countries. Each country faces significant extinction threats due to human activities, such as land use change, deforestation and desertification, pollution of land, air and water, invasive species, and climate change. Both countries recognise the need to improve their environmental laws and governance to cope with the ecological crises that each country faces, as well as globally. So the workshop has enabled academics and practitioners from both countries to share insights and knowledge on common issues in biodiversity conservation. So as you have known by participating in the conference over the last couple of days, the discussions have been grouped under 5 topics. It's useful just to briefly recap. So the first panel dealt with the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Now, this framework is currently being negotiated at the 15th Conference of the Parties under the Convention on Biological Diversity and is being hosted by China. The second panel dealt with heritage and protected areas. The Biodiversity Convention emphasises the importance of in situ conservation, whilst the World Heritage Convention and the Ramsar Wetlands Convention provide for the preservation of areas of outstanding natural heritage and wetlands, respectively. The third panel dealt with the China-Australia Migratory Birds Agreement. CAMBA, as its acronym, is one of 3 bilateral migratory bird treaties, the others being the Japan-Australia Migratory Bird Agreement, JAMBA, and the Republic of Korea and Australia Migratory Bird Agreement, ROCAMBA. And all 3 are intended to conserve migratory birds in the East Asia, Australasia flyways. The fourth panel dealt with Antarctica. Both Australia and China have interest in the protection of the Antarctic and its biodiversity, including under the Antarctic Treaty. The fifth panel dealt with marine biodiversity in areas beyond natural and national jurisdictions. Now, marine biodiversity does not recognise or respect national jurisdictional boundaries. This necessitates consideration of invoking conservation measures outside state boundaries. So this final panel is intended to close the discussion at the workshop. The 4 speakers may pick up thoughts and themes from the earlier panel discussions, but I doubt that they will also provide insights into avenues for future cooperation between Australia and China in biodiversity conservation. The format for this panel will be that each speaker will speak for 15 minutes. I'll introduce briefly each speaker before inviting them to speak. At the end of the hour of presentations, we'll hold a question and answer session. Please post any questions you might have on the Q&A function or in the chat. I'll monitor those functions and ask the relevant speaker any questions asked. Speakers, you may also ask another speaker a question, facilitating a dialogue between participants. So I now come to our first speaker, which is Professor Guifeng Xu. Guifeng Xu is a distinguished professor of international law at Koguan Law School, Shanghai Jiao Tong University. She serves as a director to the Centre for Polar and Deep Ocean Development and the Centre for the Rule of Ocean Law Studies. In addition, she has the day-to-day institutional function and responsibilities for funding management and project operation. She has research interests in the law of the sea generally, issues relating to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and state practice in particular. She chairs projects for drafting and revising national laws and regulations for the conservation of marine living resources and protection of the marine environment, and provides consultancy on policy making and practical issues to ocean-related agencies. I call upon Professor Xu.
Thank you very much, Your Justice. And thank you for your kind introduction. And first of all, I would also like to express my appreciation to the conference organizers for having me here to joining this very important event. And I really enjoyed the panelist presentations and also discussion interventions, and I learned a lot. And I like the conference convener, Dr. Liu Nengye has said in the first day, yesterday morning, about creating positive web between top scholars, scientists, and NGOs of the two countries. That's why I think this is very timely and important event. And trying to seek for common interest, concerns, and share of knowledge, understanding, and expectations to the biodiversity and their significance. And I myself, I think I'm really qualified candidate speaking for this session to look back and to see the future of the collaboration between the two countries. As probably some of you know, I got my PhD from University of Wollongong as Professor Shi Yubing, and I really benefited to be treated nicely and trained professionally. So I think I make the country my second home. Even the Aussie accent is quite dear to me, and that's one of the factors I really enjoyed the event. And my first connection with the Aussie colleagues, or Australian connections, I think this partially the Aussie sponsored project back to 1990s, quite early. I think it's post my age maybe. And there is an Australian-China institutional links program entitled Science, Law, and Policy for Management of the Marine Environment. And within that program or projects, a series of workshops or conferences were organized either by the University of Wollongong, Australia, or by my former university, Ocean University of Qingdao at that time. Now it's called Ocean University of China and located in Qingdao. So the particular one I joined in 1998, that was held in October. And the title was Preservation and Protection of Marine Environment, and to celebrate actually the UN Year of Ocean. And from those events, I started to get connected with the Wollongong unit, the Center for Maritime Policy. And we published the conference proceedings or the workshop papers and things like that bilingually with the Center for Maritime Policy occasional publications. And that's make it really very dear to me, the memory there. So I always had the publications around me all the time. And about my academic practice, I focus largely on conservation of marine living resources and protection of marine environment. And recent years really witnessed myself and my team building our strengths on deep sea mining and the polar issues. And I think since I know both countries, that's why I think I can say this is this event and also discussions is very timely and important. And it certainly will have great potential for the future collaboration between the initiatives between the two countries, and certainly will lead to fruitful outcomes. And I think for myself, I thought about it, and I think I should emphasize the theme and for this event, and also for my talk now, it's the title should be given as Together We Can Make a Difference. Why I said that, as we know, Australia has been quite advanced in marine conservation and biodiversity protection and things like that along that line. And China is moving actually faster and faster toward that direction. And that's why I said that together we can make a difference. From the perspective of natural environment, a contribution of the Chinese scientists, and China has built up its knowledge or understanding from comprehensive systematic study of the marine biodiversity. And the scientists like Dr. Cao Ling, they have really conducted a series, certainly the early generations, carried out intensive multidisciplinary research on marine life in China, in the China seas, and also have found a large quantity of species and their lifestyle characteristics. I think this really laid down the foundation for our cooperation, moving from science to policies. And from legal perspective, actually, I know China has been experiencing conceptual changes since 1970s. And my research, I understand very well about the before the 1970s, and China really, the environmental issue just went unnoticed. There is no such thing. And even after that, since the 1980s, and all the laws and regulations intended to stimulate production. And only with the start of the ocean century, particularly when China ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and prepared its own ocean agenda in 1996, and we can see the effort from the Chinese government trying to turn from a consuming economy to a sustainable or maybe responsible government or country. And this, I think the commitment during those period indicate that China is determined to strengthen the protection of the marine environment and conservation of marine living resources, and trying to realize or achieve the goal of sustainable use of the oceans. So the Chinese laws, as our Mr. Chair has introduced, I personally participated in the drafting of marine-related laws and regulations, and even enforcement activities are found to be taken more control for the marine environmental protection in China. That's very, very obvious. But I used to say that China is the weakest link of the global effort for marine conservation, given the population scale, the size, or economic influence, and also the quantity of consumption. Whatever China does wrong, the whole world just can't be right. But however, as I said, with a greater understanding of the ocean and the biodiversity significance, China has moving towards a responsible nation and generate great effort, probably more and more effort in recent years to implement or stimulate the ecological civilization. We heard this yesterday in recent years, and focusing greater attention to biodiversity issue and improving cooperation relation and support collaboration projects around the world, including Australian. And this can be seen from just a couple of things I mentioned maybe. The Marine Protection Task for 2021 to 2025, just very, very new. I think just 2 days before by the Ministry of Ecology and Environment. And this is something quite substantial, I think. We don't really see this before. And we'll emphasize with other several departments, and they've outlined 5 areas for marine protection, environmental protection, and emphasize a lot of details. Because of the time, I won't see that, but you can see it just from the web, and about how to target the pollution treatment, how to focus on the base estuaries, and how to paying attention to overall protection and systematic restoration. Really, China is trying to build up the capacity for coping with the emergency ecological disasters in the ocean, and taking all efforts possible to coordinate with climate response, marine environmental protection, and things like that. I think that just the fully leverage of the role of oceans, and make suggestions for the detailed regulations. So I think back to what we the suggested area for collaboration, maybe follow on from this event. I think we can be there are many areas we can work on, but probably the most important area connected with the theme of this event, maybe environmental protection, like as we had since 1980 about the science law policy, the interaction and the kind of continuation of the past 2-3 decades effort, and taking the existing practice, also maybe the knowledge, and just build on that and go further and deeper. And also the biodiversity conservation, probably it's a new issue coming along with the BBNJ agreement. We had a full session just earlier. So I think with these two fields, maybe we can focus on Antarctic and also the tropical science and conservative technologies, laws and regulations for coral reefs. I thought about this because I know probably some of you know, like Tony is there, China is very interested in Antarctic research, scientific research, have conducted quite a series of expeditions. And also Australia had the Great Barrier Reef and very advanced science, technology, and also regulations on the, the protection coral reefs. And China also have made some very specific protection regulations or the plans for the marine habitats, and that including the coral reefs and things like that. So I think for this area, we have a lot to do together, including the scientists and policymaker practitioners, and people will be all interested in this area. Like China has also emphasized the how to restore the restoration of coral reefs, and the Ministry of Ecology and Environment even set up 3 bureaus that govern the drainage basins or connected sea area to promote integrated supervision to improve the marine environment governance. And that's quite relevant to our event or the intention for the conference organizers, and trying to reverse the deterioration of the marine ecosystem and to conserve the biodiversity by protecting and restoring the animal habitats. In its 14th 5-year plan, you already know we always have a 5-year plan guiding for the period and beyond. And so I think these are the areas really we can see from the governmental policy statement, and emphasizes about ecological functions of habitat for key species, and coral reefs certainly stand out in that area. And trying to I think these are really the area of give us great potential for us for future collaboration. So I think with that, I think for this event, I think we can maybe based on the outcome from this event, and then we can look further and see if we can start maybe the pilot or the trial kind of initiative. That's really I would like to see, and hope personally to join this effort. With that, I conclude my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Xu. The next speaker is Professor Tony Press, an adjunct professor at the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies and the Australian Antarctic Program Partnership, both at the University of Tasmania. He was formerly the CEO of the Antarctic Climate and Ecosystems Cooperative Research Centre from 2009 to 2014. Earlier still, from 1998 to 2008, Dr. Press was the director of the Australian Antarctic Division. He chaired the Antarctic Treaties Committee for Environment Protection from 2002 to 2006. He was Australia's representative to the Committee for Environmental Protection and the alternative representative to Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings from 1999 to 2008. And he was Australia's Commissioner to the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources from 1998 to 2008. Thank you, Professor Press. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm recovering from COVID. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Good. So I'll bat away. Way before I hit the Antarctic, in fact, I worked in the north of Australia, and I had a fair bit to do with Ramsar, with the migratory birds, various migratory birds agreements, and the management of Australia's significant national parks in the north and in the Indian Ocean and dealt a lot with the species that have been talked about over the last few days. It was a very good time of my life. More recent years, of course, as you point out, I've been deeply involved in the science of and the management of the Antarctic area, the oceans surrounding Antarctica, and what we generally refer to as Antarctica and the Southern Ocean. Biodiversity knows no single human-drawn boundary. It means that global biodiversity has to be managed at a national level, has to be dealt with at a regional level, and has to be conserved at a global level. And this is becoming much, much more urgent with climate change. The biggest threats to Antarctica are from climate change, and not climate change in the future, but climate change right now. These threats will manifest themselves in species responses, in ecosystem responses, but they'll also manifest themselves in human reactions. Some of those reactions will be positive, and some of them will be negative. And in managing climate change and its impacts on the Antarctic environment and its ecosystems, we need to make sure that we have a very keen eye on the human factor and on the geopolitics that surround human endeavours around the globe. Climate change will manifest its impacts in the Antarctic through depopulation and reduced productivity of the global tropics. Global tropics under climate change will begin to become less and less productive, and the bands of productivity in the oceans will move north and south. That's profound in terms of global populations and in terms of traditional global resources of protein. Species themselves will move, and there's already quite a corpus of scientific literature on the north and south migration away from the tropics of various species. And here in Tasmania, we're recording all the time new species that were known only on the big island of Australia that are now moved down the coast of Tasmania due to the warming coastal currents here. The same will happen in the Antarctic. And that has not only biological and ecological impacts, it also has geopolitical impacts as well. In Antarctica itself, there will be changes in ocean temperature, in ocean salinity, in the pH or the acidity of the ocean, changes in stratification of the ocean, changes in ocean currents, changes in ice shelves and sea ice, and changes in productivity. All of these things will be happening at the same time and at different rates, and sometimes in certain regions they might even happen catastrophically. And these changes will result in changes in population distribution and in community structure. I mean, quite obviously now in Antarctica, we certainly can see changes in the distribution of penguin species. We can also see changes in the distribution of other species as well. Perhaps one of the most profound changes that is entirely possible is a change, at least in some areas of Antarctica, from a krill-based ecosystem to a salp-based ecosystem, which would mean at the top of the food chain, a shift away from the resources that are needed to support penguins, seals, and whales, to ecosystems that are dominated by fish species. Before I move on to the human elements, I'll move on to the management elements of the Antarctic, and just say that historically the Antarctic Treaty System and the instruments within the Antarctic Treaty System, including the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, has been very, very active, very, very precautionary, and very, very successful in managing threats to individual species and to ecosystems. I think one of the most significant, scientifically measurable and successful global conservation measures has been the reduction in bycatch of endangered albatrosses. When I first became engaged in the late 1990s, thousands and thousands of albatross were being caught in the Southern Ocean in longline fisheries each year. Now you can count them on your hands. This was done through the global commitment of the members of the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, working with other countries to bring about conservation measures that were directly aimed at reducing the death of albatrosses in Antarctic Southern Ocean fisheries. There are many other successes that I could point to, but my point here is that the Antarctic Treaty System has all of the components that are required to conserve not only species, but also ecosystems and ecosystem processes in the Antarctic and the Southern Ocean. And those tools are available to the globe. And it will become increasingly more and more important that those tools are used, because as climate change impacts the productivity of fisheries around the world, the Southern Ocean fisheries need to be, the Southern Ocean fisheries and the associated ecosystems need to be protected for the benefit of the globe as a whole, not just as a resource and not only as a resource, but also as the seeding grounds for future global fisheries. It's important to retain Southern Ocean ecosystem services as global pressures increase. In recent years, there's been the use of national interest and bad science to undermine initiatives to conserve species, ecosystems, and implement precautionary fisheries measures in the Antarctic and the Southern Ocean. I'll point to one, and that is Russia's arguments in recent years, Kamalaya last year in particular, about the sustainability of fisheries around the South Georgia region of Antarctica, where unjustifiable science was used to support the blocking of consensus by one country on an important regional, but also global precautionary fisheries measure. We can't let those kinds of false arguments enter the panoply of discussions that we need to have in order to protect the planet from climate change. Professor Sway talked about cooperation between Australia and China in Antarctic science. And I think there are many grounds where we should and could actively cooperate. When I was director of the Antarctic Division, we had many Chinese scientists coming to Australia to work with us. I think those areas of cooperation should be in species studies, in ecosystem structure and function studies, in marine and terrestrial environmental change, and in the amassment, the collection of regional and Antarctic-wide information that underpin our ability to describe and manage the ecosystems. There are currently geopolitical blockages that are inhibiting those efforts or the ability to expand the cooperation. But I think that they should be overcome. And I think we should look forward to a future where Australia and China can work together on those components of environmental and ecological research that are important for understanding the future of Antarctica in the global climate system, for understanding the future of Antarctica in environmental protection, to understand the future of Antarctica as a critical component of global ecosystems. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Press. Our third speaker will now be Associate Professor Ningay Liu, who's standing in for Professor Tianbao Qin of Wuhan University. Unfortunately, Professor Qin has been experiencing poor internet connections as he is in a remote area, which has made his participation in this session difficult. So Professor Liu is currently Professor and Director of the Centre for Environmental Law at Macquarie University at Sydney, although shortly he will be going to Singapore. He has taken the lead in editing two books, The European Union and the Arctic, published by Brill in 2017, and Governing Marine Living Resources in the Polar Regions, published by Edward Elgar in 2019. He's also published over 50 referee journal articles and book chapters over the last decade and delivered hundreds of presentations. He's the co-chair of American Society of International Law's International Environmental Law Interest Group. He's a member of the governing board of the IUCN Academy of Environmental Law, representing Oceania. And he also sits on the editorial board of two journals, Marine Policy and Ocean Development and International Law. I call upon Professor Liu.
Thank you, Brian. I'm just jumping in to replace Tianbao, who sends his apology that he is now in Nairobi in a hotel with poor internet connection. Well, he's actually attending the CBD negotiation at the moment, so that's why he couldn't join us today. I will be very brief about my presentation, but I would like to report to all of you about a little bit further about this Australia-China environmental cooperation conference, where we are and why am I so pleased about this conference. So the conference has been going on for 2 days now. We started preparing for organizing this conference pretty late because this conference is part of the project funded by National Foundation for Australia-China Relations. And we only had a grant contract in May. So pretty much in mid-May, we posted the call for papers. And the deadline for the call for papers was the 10th of June. And we finalized the program actually only last Friday. So it's a very tight time frame, but I'm very pleased to see the overwhelming response to our conference. In a very short period of time, we received 17 submitted abstracts. Only 3 were accepted. So yesterday, Michelle was saying that our conference is probably the most competitive conference in academia in recent years, because we are very selective in accepting abstracts. But interestingly, most abstracts are from China. Most abstracts are from China or from Europe even. I don't receive any abstract from Australia. So we publicized the program on Friday, actually Friday evening, and upon a 2 days notice, we received 208 registrations. So it's a large numbers of participants from both Australia and China, and also many other countries. Like we even had one presentation from Indonesia, because that suits very well in that migratory birds panel. So some birds, they have habitats in China, they have habitats in Australia, but they stop over in Indonesia. So that is wonderful kind of representation about this kind of a biodiversity conference, and also to showcase the kind of a connection, the intrinsic connection of species. And I draw a comparison with humans as well. So yes, I'm so touched by now because over the 2 days, we pretty much had a very kind of a list of high quality presentations from Australian and Chinese speakers. For every single panel, we have to extend the panel, the time of the panel, because there's so many things to say and talk, and people are genuinely just smiling during the panels. And also we have had warm discussions among panelists and also between panelists and the participants. So I pretty much counted my CV, not just to show off, but just really to see how many conferences and workshops I have organized since 2015. And so in total, including this one, over the past 7 years, I have organized 16 conferences and workshops. And I must say, and it is to my surprise until now, that this Australia-China workshop on biodiversity law and governance is the most meaningful conference I have ever organized in my career so far. Well, I still have a long time to go. So, I mean, but so far at this point, this is definitely the most meaningful one. And I had this idea to organize the Australia-China conference ever since I came to Australia in 2015. I told Paul Martin about my idea, but I think it is even better that I get it done at this point. Why? Because I think everyone has experienced or has seen one way or another that we have all been caught in these geopolitical tensions over the past 5, 6, 7 years. And I think it is pretty extraordinary at this point that we can even have this conference goes ahead and with very genuine exchange of ideas and discussions from Chinese speakers and Australian speakers. And so to reach this point is already a big deal to me. And so that's why I'm so pleased about that. And also, when talking about this kind of we are all caught up in this in this geopolitical tension. I was invited by Asia Link. Asia Link is a think tank affiliated with University of Melbourne in May to write a piece about Australia-China relations ahead of the federal election. So that was the first time that I sit down and reflect my experience about this Australia-China relations over the past 7 years. And I suddenly realized, what exactly is this geopolitical tension? What does that really mean to all of us as academics, NGOs, and also scientists from both countries? What I see, I think what really behind this geopolitical tension or the term of geopolitical tension is some kind of forces trying to sever the connections. So some kind of the forces trying to really stop people from exchanging their views and also to talk to each other. So that is why when I put this conference on the table and got funded, my plan is to make my own contribution, even though it's very minor and little, to maintain this almost broken connection. So I'm not trying to fix or let's say reset the Australia-China relations, because that's the job for the government. But I think as an academic, what I'm trying to do, and I hope and I think this is endorsed by all the good colleagues and friends, is to maintain our connection between the two countries, to engage with substantive and material dialogues. So that is pretty much the whole point behind this kind of this conference. And also to move forward, I have two observations for the Australia-China environmental cooperation per se. I think the first thing is, this has been raised by, for example, Professor Marcus Howard earlier last week when I was in Hobart, is every country has legitimate security concern. Well, this is legitimate. There is no doubt people have the security concerns in mind. And we have seen the security topics being discussed by media from both China and Australia again and again and again. But where is the boundary, or where is the balance between security and other topics and issues? So I think what we should try to avoid in any area of cooperation is do not securitize everything. So we can have security in mind, but do not securitize everything, because if we look into things from that lens, then it will be very difficult for any collaboration and cooperation. And the problem is, if things are being securitized, then it will be difficult to maintain the connection and the exchange of ideas. So sometimes countries, like people, they disagree with each other. But in my view, that is totally fine, because as long as you maintain a dialogue, you keep talking, even you talk in different languages, but still, sooner or later, people at least will understand each other to avoid any misunderstanding. And the second point that I would like to make is also based on my own experience. And also I can recall Professor Xue, Professor Shi Bing, and Professor Tianbao Qing's experience with Australia, because also Tianbao told me the first time he went abroad was also, he came to Australia as a master student when Bamboo, when he was a professor at the University of Sydney, he got an ARC linkage grant, and then he invited Professor Wang Xi and his master students to Sydney. I mean, that was overwhelming, right? So the first country for people, the first country abroad is always the best. I recall myself, like I'm forever kind of grateful with Belgium, because that's the first country I went abroad after I left China. I spent 5 years doing my PhD. But the thing is, that is only one part or one step of the relationship. I think those people, they studied abroad and then they went back to their home country. I mean, then they carry the good memories of the country where they studied. But then the thing is, the relationship is moving towards the next stage, which is going to be matured. So it could not be always be like one side teach another side. I think that is something I think I have observed over the past years. So that is what I call the maturity of the relationship between two countries. And I think that is something maybe that may need to be kind of noted in the future Australia-China environmental cooperation. So with that, I think that's pretty much what I want to say. And I will just leave this to Paul Martin for his notes. Thank you.
Good, thank you, Professor Liu. So yes, that does bring us to our fourth speaker, Professor Paul Martin. He's the director of the Australian Centre for Agriculture and Law in the School of Law at the University of New England. The Ag Law Centre researches rural governance, particularly of natural resources, and the interest of rural people. He also chairs the law school's Research Advisory Committee. So Paul's been leading that centre for well over 15 years. Before an academic, he was a corporate lawyer, advisor, venture capitalist, and a chairman of public and private companies. You may wonder why that's relevant, but it does give Paul his unique ability to see governance systems and structures, and that places him in a different position to many academics. He's published more than 100 publications. He's been involved in seminars in China, Brazil, United Kingdom on different methodologies for environmental law research. He's been involved in the joint IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law and Environmental Law Centre project on evaluating environmental law, and he's a member of the governing board of the IUCN Academy of Environmental Law. Professor Martin, the chair, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I should say I'm a former member of the governing board. I now chair the research committee. So when Nengye asked me if I'd be interested in doing this, and I looked at the program, I thought about now, we should be starting to look more carefully beyond institutions and instruments, which is what lawyers, environmental lawyers in particular, that and ecosystem issues tend to get focused around, and think a bit more about the collaboration and cooperation part of this. And Nengye has partly addressed that issue as well. And about my point of view, it's human relationships that fundamentally underpin research collaboration in its many forms. So it was about 50 years ago that I first went to Hong Kong, and there I had a wonderful time. I learnt a lot. I finally discovered something I'd never known, the joys of shopping, which of course is a very much a Hong Kong thing, and eating, which was very much a Hong Kong thing. Then a few years later, I went to Beijing and I had a holiday there. And one of the things that struck me most was an incident. I went to a museum. It was a Chinese history museum, which lots of stuff about the rise of China as an independent communist republic. And I met this man in the museum. I was sort of wandering around, not understanding anything much that I saw. And he came up to me, and he was, of all things, a coal miner. And he had been taught a bit of English, and then he'd gone on and basically taught himself as best he could. And he was there with his granddaughter. And I had a wonderful few hours with them. Their English was not very good, but it was way better than my Chinese. And it was that relationship that made the world of difference. It allowed me to understand a lot more about what was going on. So I then began to read a lot of history about China, became very interested. I even struggled through an English version of the Analects of Confucius, which I still have no idea what it was about. But it made me very aware of the richness of China and of the incredible performance that it's had from what was a very, very difficult period of time and a long history with its own complexities. So it wasn't until 2009 that I went to Wuhan for the Academy of Environmental Law Colloquium. And I was the lead editor for the book that came out of that. And I got to read a lot of work done by Chinese scholars. I got to understand the incredible sophistication of how China governs its people and its environment. Now, there are real problems with some of that, as we all know, but there are problems everywhere. You could not point to Australia and say it's got a perfect history of good governance and fair treatment of people. And neither could you with China, or probably with no country could you necessarily point at that. So then I spent various times at the Research Institute for Environmental Law in Wuhan. I've had the pleasure of teaching postgraduate students from that institution and other institutions in China. I've had the joy of collaborating with Riel's staff and with Tian Bao and Professor Du Chun, and also with Dr. Dongxie Yang, who's from the Chinese Ministry of Agriculture. My work is largely around rural environmental governance, and particularly biodiversity and rural agricultural socio-ecological systems. I learned a lot from the exchanges with Dongxie about the issues that they're concerned with and the issues that they're dealing with. I've also had the pleasure of working with people on a multi-country review of implementation of the Biodiversity Convention, and Tian Bao has been leading one of the groups on that. And working with the Ministry of Agriculture, looking at future developments, particularly issues of new technologies, new methods, and how they will affect not only production, but also the environment. I've had many conversations, attended many seminars, and I've enjoyed a lot of interaction with postgraduate students. I've read a lot, and at the end of that, I could say I know very little, because there is just so much involved in all of those things. And every time I engage with colleagues from China or visit China, I learn more about how little I know, how little I understand. I'll come back to that in a moment. One thing I do know to do with my Chinese colleagues: characteristics, integrity, efficiency, collegiality, great generosity and good fellowship. That's a constant. Seriousness and intensity about scholarship is something that I see all the time, and particularly with postgraduate students, I see that. Significant differences in how the systems work. One of the things that struck me at one point is the way in which the Chinese national government manages community tension as a way of partly managing its relationship with other parts of government. For example, trying to discipline local government to achieve national environmental outcomes by using citizen action and channeling that action to try and change the outcomes. It's an incredibly complex game that they play. Respect to what China has achieved, but also a greater sensitivity to the sources of some of the tensions that exist between Australia and China, particularly US and China. The US, I think a lot of those tensions that we see are a reflection of a cultural belief that the only reason you don't win is because you haven't tried hard enough. And then when you look at what's happened as America has lost its hegemony economically, or fears losing its hegemony, then you can see some of the Trumpian type things all being partly reflection of those fear and anger based on a fear that we've missed out or we're not trying hard enough because they've seen the rise of China, and then that washing over into Australia's relationship with both those countries. So there are big forces that shape those difficulties. I have identified some differences in academia, particularly minor things like concepts of plagiarism and how widely understood policy gets picked up and the words are used, and I myself think, no, this isn't plagiarism, this is the way in which the Chinese scholarly community deals with policy. For me, my biggest issue, my biggest concern though, is when I deal with students and they are wonderful people and they're really active and energetic, and I worry about them saying things that get them into trouble. I really do worry about that. I'm quite careful in how I communicate because enthusiasm and openness to ideas is brilliant, but in a context where there's all sorts of tensions and it can lead into trouble. And I think we, particularly Australians who tend to be a bit disrespectful of everything, we need to be a bit more careful often about how we manage those issues. My thoughts about the future. We are going to see more intense tensions over the environment and between countries. I can't see us getting out of that because of the way the world is going and the number of turbulences that exist. So if we want to have a fruitful Australia-China environmental cooperation, we're going to have to work hard to make that happen. It's not going to happen the way it's happened in the past. We will really have to actively create relationships and trust and ways of dealing with issues that when they are affected by broader tensions. So close and trustful collaboration, sensitivity to the differences. Again, there are issues in both countries, but how we deal with them, how we talk about them will make a lot of difference. It is the duty of all of us to try to be well informed. As I said, I've learned a lot from reading history because it makes me far less arrogant about what goes on. There are many reasons. I remember meeting an old Chinese scholar in Wuhan. He was very old, and he'd been tortured during the Cultural Revolution. He'd had an awful time, and one of the most useful conversations, his English was surprisingly good, was about what he had learned from his lived experience about China and the nature of the country. What's the future? Well, if we are going to live in that more complex and often fraught world, then we will need deeper scholarly and personal links so that we can ride our way through that and not get caught up in it. We'll need to identify stronger areas of mutual interest in scholarship and in practical biodiversity governance. So the ones that I see, I think there are meta level issues. For example, behavioural effectiveness, efficiency and transaction costs, political economy and those political economy issues of making effective environmental laws and implementation. There is so much more we need to learn about those issues. So environmental law is not only about instruments and rules and other such things, it's also about human behaviour and institutional behaviour. And there's a lot that both in China and Australia that we scholars can learn about those things. And the fact that our countries are so different is a fantastic experimental opportunity, because if you get the same patterns coming from such diverse countries, then you're probably dealing with something that's quite generalizable. Second, emerging governance issues. The one that I focus on, but it's only one of them, is technology and the significant changes that are going to arise with the radical changes in technology. Our environmental governance systems are so far behind in harnessing what's available with technology and in responding to the impact of technologies. And I think we can get ahead of the game between China and Australia. That's a space we could work on. Third one, this is from left field, but law is significantly about conflict. And we have brilliant mechanisms for trying to deal with conflict or potential conflict. I think an issue for the future is going to be norms for the pro-cooperation. Now, community engagement and citizen involvement and all these things, they sit around the boundaries, but I suspect we're going to need new mechanisms to deal with building trustful relationships. And both our countries need to address that, and we need to address those things together. I think there is an opportunity to build a genuine shared research agenda, even though there are things that might kind of push us apart, notably tensions over resource and geopolitical tensions. But dialogue about what are the right research questions for the next century and what are the methods and the new methods, I think there's rich opportunity in that space that we could address. Finally, one of the keys to making all of this work is enjoying learning from each other, genuinely wanting to learn from each other and helping each other. Helping each other, I provide information to some colleagues from China. They ask things, I ask them questions. That's really beneficial. So building a helping relationship is important. And I think that's, with the last thing is mentoring and building scholars who can move between jurisdictions and between cultures and can do that in a comfortable way. So my last point, this is all about building the interpersonal dimension that'll make the scholarly dimension work. If we get the interpersonal right, then I think we can do a great deal more on the scholarly side. That's all from me.
Thank you, Professor Martin. I'm going to say a few things just to wrap up with the discussion, but can I encourage people again to ask some questions. We've got 4 marvellous and knowledgeable panelists here. So please ask some questions. You can either post them on the Q&A or even in the chat. We can look either way to do it, but please take the opportunity now to think about what your questions are and to post those so we can ask them. I wanted to just start, before I just summarize some of the things that the speakers have said, I wanted to go back to a conference that I went to in China that had a very long relationship with working with and in China. So this was actually in 1992 in Wuhan. It was an international symposium on environmental law. And I gave a paper on the harmonization and globalization of international and domestic environmental law at the time. So, but I wanted to refer to the opening address given by a very distinguished professor of law, Han Depei. He was at the time, the Emeritus Dean of the School of Law, and he was the former director of the Research Institute of Environmental Law at Wuhan. I'm just going to read some of his quote, because remarkably, they are just as relevant today. So we're dealing with 2022, and he gave it in 1992. Here's what's so. He says, as we all know, the rapid deterioration of the Earth environment is one of the most serious challenges facing us today. Cooperation and coordination among all nations of the world, no matter they are rich or poor, developed or developing, is absolutely needed for dealing with the challenge. So too, the cooperation and coordination amongst environmental law experts of the world. And then cutting to something else, he says that particular conference is the first large international symposium on environmental law initiated and hosted by Chinese academic institutions and attended by environmental law experts from around the world. So that was the first, that's where it started. So he says the symposium we're having now shows the desire of its participants to learn from the experiences and lessons of other countries and regions in environmental regulation and management. Environmental jurisprudence is a part of human civilization and a common wealth shared by all nations of the world. Sharing of environmental jurisprudence benefits the development and improvement of environmental law systems and environmental protection in all nations. He says, comparatively speaking, the course of environmental protection in China is rather young in its development. China is eager to learn from the experience of environmental protection of other countries, as so too the Chinese environmental law experts. He then comes up to this and says, the symposium we're having now indicates also the necessity of increasing the channels and improving the material conditions for our cooperation and exchange in environmental law. For this purpose, we may consider to build up an international fund for environmental law cooperation and exchange, to publish an international environmental law newsletter, and to set up an international research center of environmental law. And he says that RIO, the Research Institute of Environmental Law, would be happy to work with participants for the realization of these plans. Now, and that's only some of what he said. By the way, there's the conference proceedings, you can see. And it was something which has been picked up really by the speakers here. I'll just pick up some of the points. So Professor Shui talked about together we can make a difference, and I think that's important. So what are the things that we can do together? Well, firstly, she said about multidisciplinary research. So that may be that we need to, for lawyers, to talk to scientists, for scientists to talk to lawyers, to talk to social scientists, not just natural scientists, to talk to economists, to talk to policy gurus, to share that knowledge. Different ways of knowing the world is important, and they need to be shared so that others can have that insight. They talked about cooperation and collaboration, of course, between China and Australia, but also talked about what is the content of that. It's not only laws and strategies and policies, but ways of going about it. So obviously Professor Shu has been involved with drafting laws. So have I. So have many of the people who participated in this workshop. We have different ways of thinking about how to solve the problem and putting that in legal language, which is going to be effective. But it's also about institutions and structures and processes. Institutions matter, as Jeremy Waldron has said. So it's not just the laws, it's who's to administer those laws. That's important, and we can learn from that. And it's about governance, structures, and processes, something that Professor Martin has worked on a lot. But let's just take eco-civilization, for example. There is a lot to be learned there about how China is going through this experiment. I mean, it didn't know where it was going to head when it started the experiment, but it's learning and, you know, developing that eco-civilization project with some marvelous successes. You know, other countries, including Australia, can learn from what they have been doing there. And there's also about sharing technology and know-how. And so that was talked about by Professor Martin as well, about technology. But also we should think about the soft idea, about the know-how, about how to go about things. And so that whether it is for marine environment, coral reefs, or ecological functioning, or terrestrial systems for biodiversity, sharing that knowledge will be important. Professor Press picked up a point I had made in my introduction, that biodiversity doesn't know about national boundaries, that we need to, and that drives us to cooperate. Because by definition, the biodiversity is not going to stay in the national jurisdiction. It's going to cross boundaries, whether they be terrestrial or marine boundaries, or go into the commons. We need to come up with ways to cooperate if we are to conserve that biodiversity. He also recognizes that the problems facing biodiversity are global. Climate change is the obvious example, but we can think about many others. Climate change induces changes in ocean functioning and circulation. We can think of the plastics, the problem of that, you know, which are spreading all around the world. Indeed, I wrote recently, there is now no place on Earth that is untouched by humans. Humans have had an imprint everywhere in the world, from the most remote areas to obviously the most settled areas. And so if we are to solve environmental problems, we need cooperation. And he identified a number of areas, particularly in science, where we can cooperate. So Professor Liu also talked on a more personal basis about that, his background to the organization of that. And I was conscious when he was speaking about that film, I think Kevin Costner starred in it, called Field of Dreams, Build It and They Will Come. But what it really shows when that is happening, that was about a baseball field, of course, in the corn. He built it and it became a very successful baseball venue. But what it shows is that there is this latent demand which is pent up. We may not recognize it, but when we build it, when we organize it, we see that demand being manifested. So here, there was this demand for better relationships and cooperation in this particular area between Australia and China. And the fact that within 3 days, over 200 people signed up to it shows that latent demand. And I think also what he said is a point that Paul Martin comes to, is about the importance of starting with personal relationships. So when you solve problems, in this case, you know, perhaps a little fractured relationship between Australia and China as countries at the government and, you know, business levels, how do you solve that? Well, like another Chinese has said, every journey begins with a single step. You've got to start with the small things. And so starting with these types of workshops, build up the personal working relationships. That's how you mend the breakdown in interpersonal and interinstitutional relationships. So you focus on areas of mutual interest where there can be mutual benefit, the win-win. And then it makes it easy to do that. And you slowly work with that, and then it snowballs and builds up, and then you have much better relationships at higher levels. And also he talked about the importance of maintaining a dialogue. You've got to keep talking with one another, and that's what's important. So then finishing with Professor Martin, and he said again that, you know, we shouldn't overly focus on institutions. That will be important, as Professor Handepai said, but you start with personal relationships. And so I've said that I've been working with China since 1992. I have many dear friends. And the other thing you find, of course, is that when you have been teaching and doing things as long as I have, 42 years now, you find that the people that you teach are suddenly in very important positions. So I can remember training all of the judges of the Supreme People's Court of China in the Environmental Division, as well as the prosecutors. And let's get a bit of light here. And I had a number of these Supreme Court judges come up to me and said, you know, you taught me when I was a master's student at Wuhan back in 1990. And, you know, they've gone on to do many other things. And so I've had many professors who are professors today, but they were students before. And so, you know, it's that building of the personal relationships. And I have maintained those relationships over many years. And so I think that's a very important. And Paul's, you know, good advice about that you have to be active. You've got to work hard at building those relationships. You've got to be sensitive and tolerant of differences, and you've got to actively find areas of common interest. And when you do that, you build up those relationships. So Paul identified a number of areas where he thought we can do that, to identify areas of scholarship and research, and he identified those, looking at emerging governance issues, understanding that law is essentially about conflict. It's about solving conflicts and disputes that come up. And he says, comes back to, we've got to have that desire to learn from each other and enjoy doing that. So I think those are really useful insights into how we can go forward and build upon, as I say, and echo what Professor Handepai said back in 1992. So with that, can I ask if there are any? I can't see any at the moment in the chat, nor can I directly see something in the question and answer. But if somebody does have something, or even one of the panelists would like to ask somebody else a question, could you now raise your hand or post that? All right. Right. Well, then I'm just going to suggest something we go forward. As I said, well, the quote I gave from Professor Handepai was to make a call for doing something in the future. And I think that it would be remiss if we left this workshop without coming up with some agenda as to what could be the avenues for cooperation in the future. So it doesn't have to be done right here and now in the next quarter of an hour, but can I suggest to the organizers that when they look at the outputs from this particular workshop, some agenda could be developed, perhaps building upon the ideas that have been shared in this closing discussion, but also build upon what has been earlier said in the previous panels. And that way, there will be a definite outcome for cooperation in the future. And that can be not restricted to the particular hosts institutions. So obviously here Macquarie University and Wuhan University in China, but should be in any institutions in Australia and China, because this is a cooperation that should span academic boundaries. Paul, thank you for raising your hand. You've got a question.
This one's a comment or a suggestion. The IUCN Academy of Environmental Law colloquium is in July, and the first day of that is a research workshop. And there would be the opportunity there. People want to take forward a discussion about, I think about the idea of establishing a research agenda between China and Australia. It could involve other countries, but generating a set of important questions that we're not really tackling. So I raised the one about, how can we create law that creates norms of cooperation and reduced conflict, for example. I think that's a big question that we'll need to address at some point. And there's bunches of others. So I'm making the suggestion, if people want to bring stuff forward for that, the research workshop for the colloquium, then you'd be more than welcome to do so.
It just came to my mind that one particular interesting presentation yesterday, that quite a few people came to me to talk about that. Sarah talked about that, Paul Govin talked about that, is that that presentation by Assistant Professor Bingbing Li about how to better design buildings to avoid the birth collision. So, I mean, that is just this is pretty much further to what I said, to maintain dialogue, to avoid kind of a misunderstanding. But I think that there are something, this is a perfect example about some kind of future agenda setting. It's like, you don't really need to be just understand each other. Actually, like Paul Govin was talking to me this morning, that Australia has just started thinking about building designs, about combating climate impact. While I think according to Professor Bingbing Li, his campus in China now has completely adopted this kind of new design to avoid birth collision and save the thousands of births a year. I mean, that's a fantastic kind of a citizen science that I could think of. I mean, there could be some kind of a very specific project like that to go on. That's just one example that just came to my mind, which also is much better than maintain. I was I had a very low expectation that just maintain this kind of a relationship. No, it's not like that. It's really something can move forward.
And just going back to some of the ideas that Professor Han Depay put forward back in '92. So one was, I'll just summarize again. So that was an international fund for environmental law cooperation exchange. That's probably optimistic. The second was an international environmental law newsletter. Now, of course, there are many now international, environmental law newsletters that wasn't then. But one could think of some sort of newsletter which is a vehicle to share ideas and research initiatives for cooperation between Australia and China. That could be hosted by any institution, but that might be as I say, a vehicle for maintaining a dialogue. It doesn't have to be a high-level academic journal. Indeed, I think it would defeat the purpose to do that. Rather, it is more a clearinghouse of ideas. People put in, what the latest ideas and initiatives or workshops or ideas which is coming up into that newsletter. So that's just something I put repeat from what he said back in '92. The other was he talked about an international research centre of environmental law. So now that may be a bit more ambitious because that it has to be hosted by a particular academic institution, and as we all know, that can be rather difficult. But I'm just wondering here, there is already certain centres and institutions for Australia-China cooperation. Indeed, some of the grant money that was allowed this workshop to be held is one such institution. I raise a possibility: could that host such an institution host such a body, so that that also could act as a clearinghouse for cooperation between different institutions in Australia and China. So I just throw that up. They're not my initiatives. They were ones thought of back in 1992, but can we adapt them and embrace them today? So any other thoughts that people might have, particularly from the participants? Anyone listening in would like to just make a contribution, even if it's not a question? Yes, I see Dr. Michelle Lim. Yes, please.
Thanks, Brian, and thank you to all the speakers for what has been, for me, a really touching panel, this final concluding panel, but also the warmth and messages that have come through in this workshop. So on the one hand, it is to celebrate that has come through so strongly amidst what is a difficult time geopolitically. But then I suppose my question is, and given the challenges we see at a government level, my question is, how do we translate that beyond the scholarly community? How does the scholarly community, civil society, how do we band together to bring this close connection amongst academics into the greater political space?
Nothing like an easy question.
Yeah, we can apply for the next round of National Foundation for Australia-China funding.
Well, actually, can I just pick up on, I think in part what Michelle has highlighted is more like a major strategic research question for the scholarly community. You know, how do we build collaboration? I think that's a big issue. And how can laws and instruments actually build collaboration? Sorry, I'll stand back now.
Yeah, no. Yes, Professor Xu.
Yes. I don't think I can answer Michelle's question, but as it's really challenging. But I think I can share some of the experiences between China, Japan, Korea. The colleagues, we work together always quite close. But the relations, I mean, at governmental level. So I think that's it for that. We do the marine conservation, we do the environmental protection, and it's always going on with scientists, with scholars in policy level and things like that. Even governmental officials, they participated by their personal capacity. So I think Australia and China has never been in that difficult situation. So certainly we can find our ways. As I talked about earlier, we have a lot of existing experiences there. So if we can carefully design the selected program and make step-by-step objective or goals, and then with proper paths, we can certainly make our contribution to improve the situation for the general marine conservation or biodiversity. That's what I want to say. I feel hopeful about our future collaboration.
Yeah,
thank you.
I just want to follow Julia and also Paul, follow up your comments. I think this is kind of my conclusion last week in a workshop in Hobart that really kind of make me feel very calm. That is, people have been talking about that the world has changed. Yes, indeed, it has changed. So the collaboration, kind of the way of collaborations in the past is not working in the current environment. But the world is ever changing. So it's not like this is the end of the world. It's just like the world has changed, but it will just go on with changes. So I think in a new setting, in a new geopolitical environment, we also need to be, as Paul, you mentioned, we really need to work harder to think innovatively how to adapt ourselves in building collaborations in a new environment. I mean, this is now we are in a new environment. So how to do that? That's something. I just saw Sarah said, I think art has a key role in forming connections. I fully agree. Yes, a picture is more than 1,000 words, right?
Yes, so we just in the Q&A, Alistair Graham just notes, I remain impressed at the success of the first round of CBD EBSA workshops in building relationships, sharing knowledge and skills for a specific policy purpose. So round 2 is under discussion at the CBD, and that could be a good instance, picking up on Professor Martin's way of, we need to do some research about how to go about this. But Alistair, I think, is making a suggestion that there could be an instance of where there has been success in building relationships and sharing knowledge. So thank you, Alistair, for that. Well, I think that maybe brings us to the end of this panel discussion. So thank you, participants, for your insights. I think that's been a very useful way to conclude the workshop. So I'll bring that to an end, but I might just now go to Professor Liu. You may want to say something just to close the whole workshop itself.
Yes, thank you so much, Brian. Beyond words of thanking everybody, I think I would like to particularly thank 3 people that make this workshop not only just happen so smoothly, but also vibrantly. And the first one is Julian Chen. Julian, could you please turn on your videos? Or? Yes, so Julian has been instrumental, I mean, tremendously instrumental in making this happen. I mean, he has been working with me intensively over the past 30 days, pretty much in such a short time frame to invite everyone, put up the program, and also design such a beautiful kind of conference program. And Julian also now, I think actually this week, he's coming to Australia to start his PhD journey at Macquarie. So I think this is also a very good example about Australia-China environmental cooperation. So I would recommend everyone to give him a round of applause. Just really thank him for his hard work. And also, I would like to thank Sarah Wonderfield, our wonderful sales administration assistant. Sarah has been working with me kind of throughout my directorship. And every single workshop, webinar, you will see her, and she will be there consistently and diligently, and then to make sure things go smoothly. And I think with her assistance, that you can see that every time that there is a problem, she will just jump in and help solve it. So I feel so grateful to have Sarah assist me, and also in this final conference that I'm organizing in Australia. So I wish you all the best, Sarah. And also, yes, and also finally, someone behind the scene, that's our Twitter queen, Nishala McDonald. So Nishala has been live tweeting the whole conference for 2 days. Every single panel, every single presenter, she has delivered at least one very much to the point to a tweet. So that is really amazing that we have a very vibrant kind of Twitter conversation now on our sales Twitter account. So with that, and also of course, I would like to also thank you all for your support, and for Michelle and Professor Shoka Alam, and also Dr. Paul Goving, our sales team that has been supporting me, and we are supporting each other over the past 2 years. And we have really made the Center for Environmental Law of Macquarie University a vibrant place and a vibrant academic community that we can be proud of. And so, yeah, with this, I will just conclude our Australia-China joint workshop on biodiversity governance. And I wish you all the best. And I will see you when I see you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.